provocations. These are short statements by each of the panelists that are supposed to be no longer than the Gettysburg Address and equally as eloquent. And when they have finished, I will jump back in again and try to lead some of the conversation in response to what they have to say. And I think just for convenience, we'll start here next to me with Jake Heggie.
Okay.
And why don't you introduce yourself and then read your provocation.
I am Jake Heggie. And I am a local boy, and I am very glad that our natural air conditioning has returned. So it was interesting being asked to write a provocation. I've never been asked to write such a thing before, but I have been sleep deprived because of the heat and other things for about 4 days, so I'm going to read mine, just because my brain might go elsewhere. So forward is the only way it goes, and each generation creates its own cultural touchstones, sort of building on the flesh and bones of what came before, or ignoring them totally. That's true for music, fashion, theater, literature, movies, and opera. All of these cultural canons yearn to grow and evolve, and most of what was very precious to one generation gets left behind or taken for granted by the children, by the next generation, and that's part of the natural cycle. What gets us into real trouble is when we try to stop that growth and evolution because we love it too much to let it go. We can literally suffocate it with too much affection. And that definitely happened somewhat in the opera world during the 20th century. It went from being a popular, lively, and varied art form in the 19th century to becoming a sacred cow, fearful of the immense changes happening everywhere else in the world, with a couple dozen titles that could only be done one way, and it got predictable and very stuck, with the terrifying experimental part of it, because it yearns to grow, happening in academia. We built extraordinary temples to that legacy and tradition, great opera houses, that were once thriving community centers of art, beauty, and music and reflection and entertainment, but they started to become ivory towers. The resistance to change in our field was kind of epic, and yet everything else around us continues to move forward rapidly. Will some of our beloved classics disappear? Of course. And might they reappear someday? Maybe. Shakespeare has done okay, and Handel did reappear after 200 years, so we don't get to predict those things. But we're going through a confusing and difficult patch right now because we can no longer hold on to what it was and how we always did it. We can cherish, treasure, and pass that forward. We can celebrate it, but we can't repeat it. Most important to me, next steps, is getting the arts back into public schools. We have to get young people involved in creating new work and participating in new work, welcoming their ideas, inspire and create big star careers and star attractions. We need big stars. The pop world is really smart, people. It creates big stars and moves forward relentlessly with innovation. I think we need to identify real theater people in our field. And we need some of that pop culture savvy, not to compromise what we love, but to spread it wider so that the next steps in the evolution can emerge. Thank you.
I would just like to say what he said.
Hi, I'm Daniel Kramer. I'm the outgoing artistic director of English National Opera, and they asked me to provoke. I believe we must balance fresh interpretations of the classic repertoire alongside daring new works which empower and expand the vocabulary of librettist, storytelling, and composition. 50-50 in each season is my goal. Museum productions and classical forms speak less and less to the desktop multitasking mind. The divide between what some of our traditional patrons want, how dare we change Violetta's classic red dress, and what our future audiences and our future donors will require. Unite under Shakespeare's wisdom. We must hold a mirror up to nature, as it were. All audiences come to hear and to see and to come closer to their secret traumas and emotions. even if that means cutting, inserting, rearranging, reorchestrating the classical. Deep inhale. Take them off the pedestals. Remove them from the 4,000-seat barns or not. Nothing is sacred save our audience's journey in the room with us. The bottom line that magnetizes audiences and defines canon status is the profundity of human and spiritual observation that any composer, librettist, creative team, or artist on stage achieves. Verdi captured the heartbreak of a woman sacrificing love due to shame. Hello, mirror. Berg wrote the heart of a man trapped at the bottom of a system. No matter how fast he ran, he would never win the race. Hello, mirror. I expect no less of Ellen Reed than Verdi, and I value Shakespeare no more than Nina Raine. The lineage and prize go to they who hold up the most painfully clear and revelatory mirrors to my soul. Be that a Versailles mirror, a Mac compact, a funhouse mirror, a broken mirror, or the most thinning mirror on earth, my favorite. History and the present tense must balance to shed light on tomorrow. Thank you.
I think what he said. I'm Nicole Paiement from Opera Parallèle, also from San Francisco, welcoming the cool weather. When the Paris Opera celebrated their 350th anniversary last year, their slogan was, "Modern since 1669." And headlines read, "Innovations keep a grand institution young." It is the reinvention of opera over centuries that has kept this art form vibrant. We all realize that institutions will not maintain their leadership by relying solely on mounting works from the past. However, the inherited repertoire creates continuity and guides us as we continue to renew the form and develop works that are linked to the world we live in. I would postulate that the older repertoire is essential to the health of our industry, but needs to be balanced by developing and celebrating current works. And as we are thankfully in a prolific time for the commissioning of new operas, we need to invest in repeated performances and varied productions of certain works to build a contemporary canon, a canon of 21st century masterworks. Many of the new operas respond to the escalating desire from our audiences to experience more intimate and immersive theatrical productions. These new works still embody the elements of what makes opera so grand: glorious singing and music making, powerful storytelling, convincing concepts, incredible collaboration. They have grand impact, but often at lower cost. With the economical challenges we are facing in the arts, these new works not only help us overcome financial challenges, they can also illuminate new ways to reimagine older repertoire into less monumental productions that speaks more to the audience of today. With this perspective, one sees the value of the entire gamut of repertoire and possibilities. While new masterworks gain from understanding past tradition, older repertoire is being rejuvenated by the new models of today, creating a balance between past and present. Two pillars that will take us to the future. This is how Paris Opera slogan goes and helps us remain modern.
Opera exists as a participatory art form between creators and receivers. The moments of transcendence in the opera house exist when the audience feels absolutely captivated by the emotional story being told on stage. The fundamental question for me is, how do we tell stories of meaning and impact? Or put differently, how do we ensure that that emotional bond between the stage and the audience is never broken? Traditional aesthetics and works can be incredibly important in resonating with audience expectations, particularly if the dramaturgy is conceived in a way that still has contemporary meaning. More modernist aesthetics or updatings can help reframe the storytelling in powerful ways and create impactful new insights. But those updatings and modernist readings still need to facilitate the emotional connection with the audience, not become a barrier. The age of the work is not relevant here. It's more how we present the work and whether the balance of tradition and modernity in both aesthetics and dramaturgy helps or hinders an audience response. Sometimes temporal distance from a story can help us as audience members have a deeper, more emotive response. We're allowed to experience the pervasiveness of certain human conditions through history. Sometimes, as particularly in Baroque opera, an updating can help us bridge traditions that no longer have contemporary meaning. In programming a piece, therefore, choosing productions and choosing artists, we constantly have to ask, will this have meaning for a particular audience in a particular city in a particular space, be that meaning aesthetic or societal? If it doesn't have any meaning, we shouldn't be producing the piece.
Hello, I'm Beth Morrison from Beth Morrison Projects and the Prototype Festival. Thank you. The world we reside within is changing at a seemingly lightning fast pace. As the world becomes smaller through globalization and technology, we can no longer operate within the paradigms that have served the opera and classical music industry for centuries. As our communities become increasingly diverse, a white male-dominated art form becomes less and less relevant to contemporary culture. As we seek analog departures from our digital world, how do we create moments of meaning for our audiences? As more and more opera companies discover success with their new opera projects that tell the stories of our contemporary world, the question has to be asked, do we need the museum pieces? Are they relevant any longer? Is there a responsibility to history to continue doing these works that are large, expensive, and often don't sell well? Do there need to be companies other than the Metropolitan doing the majority of the canon as it was originally intended? The Met is broadcasting their productions, which have higher production values than most other companies in the States, and employ star singers. Should we just let them do it and the rest of us innovate and push the art form into the future? I think you probably all know where I fall down on this. As someone who has devoted her career, company, and festival to the creation of new opera works, I believe wholeheartedly that the future of the art form lies in the creation of new work, both chamber size and grand. The future of the art form lies with the composers and librettists who are diverse in gender, race, age, and aesthetics, who want to tell relevant stories of today and who want to bring those works to diverse audiences that are both inside and outside of the opera house. The responsibility lies with the leadership of the companies to have accessible ticket prices in order to bring in the non-elite audiences, to bring the work to underserved school systems, to bring the work to prisons, hospitals, and even to the streets. This is my art form for the future.
When Mark asked me to do this panel. I said, oh, that sounds really interesting. Of course, I'd be delighted. And then Philip called me, and I found out who else was on the panel. And I thought, oh, no. I'm the establishment. Part of what I've always loved about opera and theater is that they connect us across centuries to the most important and universal emotions. When Mozart's characters are furious with each other but still deeply in love, I recognize the sound of it, and I know the feeling hasn't changed in 230 years. This is beautiful and soul-nourishing, and it's helpful information to a married person. As head of an opera company, I believe my job is to serve a community and an audience, sometimes by giving them what they know they want, and sometimes by surprising them with what they didn't know they would love. There is particular joy in the surprising, whether it's something new or something old but unfamiliar. It is okay with me if the choices are getting fewer in the familiar category. We've been putting on opera as we think of it for more than 4 centuries. We have adapted, and we will continue to adapt as times change. Above all, we have to do what we do well. The worst nights we have all spent in opera houses weren't because the work was old, it's because the production was bad. We've got to do what we do well out of love and respect for our audiences and for the artists of the present and past.
Good evening. My name is Elise Brunel. I'm here from Cape Town Opera in South Africa. Thank you. In South Africa, performing the classics, the inherited, mostly European repertoire, is crucial actually to the training and the emergence of young opera singers. We are a country of young singers. By their late 20s, the vast majority of them have been trained and they look for work overseas. It is precisely the experiences that they've had with Puccini and Donizetti and Verdi on our stage that allows them to get to those stages in Vienna and Amsterdam and London, and for our audiences to hear them master that work. It's key. When Pretty Yende sang Meyerbeer on her CD last year, and she is our first pop star, followed by quite a few more coming up, wouldn't you know it that the next year, that song played a part in the National School Choir Festival mandatory repertoire. South Africans, Zulu, isiXhosa, Afrikaans singing children from the age of 6 join in national choir festivals. This is where they learn Verdi. This is where, believe it or not, they sing Vivaldi at a young age in the townships and the rural areas. So for them to sing it on the main stage is simply natural. Indeed, the question is not so much that inherited repertoire does not have a place in Africa, but how is it that we adapt it to really reflect our ethos and who our singers are? I think about 10 years ago of a Macbeth that we did. We shook it up, we turned it around, we recomposed it, set it in the Congo, in a colonized Congo. And through that production, which went on to Korea and to France, we got South African singers on the international stages. We allowed the singers and gave them a platform to sing where they deserve to sing. So in that way, there is really a place for the standard repertoire in South Africa. It doesn't mean there aren't new works. Of course there are. We have Mandela, we have Saartjie Baartman, we have issues of migration and gangsterism all forming part of the new repertoire. But it really is the both inherited and this new repertoire that resonates with where South Africa sees itself in the 21st century, where our young voices gain their prominence and where our donors want to hear the singers and our artistic partners engage with us on the global level. And that's where I feel that we are today. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. A wonderful way to begin this panel. And I think listening to the 8 provocations, I'm picturing a Venn diagram in which most of us agree around a good body of the propositions here. That it's essential to have a core repertoire. It seems it's important, it remains relevant to what we do. That relevance, of course, is essential in no matter whether it's a new or an old work. That the quality of what we do matters more than whether or not it is new or old or what tradition it comes from. And that we need to really think about connection with audiences, maybe more than the categories into which we put things. But now let's set aside all of that agreement and try and find some of the places where maybe we're coming at these questions from slightly different places. And I thought I'd start first with the premise of the panel, and that is, or one of the premises, and that is whether or not, as opera goes forward, if we're going to find ourselves essentially doing two quite different things, championing new work, contemporary work that speaks to one audience, and maintaining a canon of works that are important to sort of having the historical pieces represented, and what happens in the middle with the other works that don't quite fit those categories. And I thought I'd ask you, Matthew, San Francisco Opera, you've said, is in the business, or is in the process of thinking about what you've called the legacy productions. You know, the big essential ones that every major repertory house has to have. And you're putting a lot of resources into remaking those. At the same time that you've got a wonderful track record of doing big main stage new works. Is there concern about that middle ground of the core repertoire that isn't Puccini, that isn't Mozart, that isn't Carmen?
I think as we think about programming, and as I've thought about it in the last few years coming into this job, I think what I am trying to do is keep a level of trust with the audience. And you know, what I say about the San Francisco audience and our particular relationship in that house is not a universal, it's just how things exist in San Francisco. And we had a really interesting experience a couple of years ago when we did Calixto Bieto's Carmen. And I think we're maybe still the only American company to have done a Bieto production. And this, as Daniel knows from E&O, is not a brand new production by any means. This is a venerable 20-year-old production. And many of us loved what we saw and the energy and the rawness and the vibrancy of that. Many in the audience loved it as well. The people who didn't love it felt aggrieved in an incredible way. And what was fascinating to me was that a big portion of the audience that was aggrieved by that were young audiences in their 20s and 30s coming for the first time. And again, this goes back to the particular opera house we have, which is this, you know, gilded frame full of red velour and gold everywhere you can see. That picture frame, if you will, creates a certain sense of expectation. And I kind of joke that, you know, people may be coming on this grand date night for the Pretty Woman experience. You know, she supposedly comes to San Francisco Opera. And they're coming for this gloriously romantic, lush experience. And we know from reactions to that Carmen that that's what really upset people when they didn't feel that. So I think as we look at programming for the future, the sense is, for me, make sure that you protect the trust around the core repertoire where there's such a high level of expectation. And once you have that, then you can be really thoughtful and diverse in how you look at the rest of the repertoire. Because once you get outside that relatively small band of works, the expectations fall off quite rapidly. You don't have to go too deep in the repertoire such that most of your audience won't have seen these pieces ever, potentially, or haven't seen them for 30 years. So to me, it's a level of trust because for whatever reason in America, audiences, at least I have found, can be very, very reactionary if they don't like something at that level. It's not just a case of, as I think you might feel in Frankfurt, for example, oh, that was a bad night at the opera, tomorrow's going to be better. It's like, you have just violated my trust in your company, I will take my subscription and rip it up. And so to me, it's about protecting that trust so that you can then do some really interesting, dynamic, and innovative works around that as well.
I'm very familiar with this type of American trust you're talking about. As a journalist, nobody says, I kind of disagree with that story. They say, I am canceling my subscription. That's the first thing out of their mouth. But I'm curious about the young people you mentioned who react to the Viejo Carmen because they wanted something more traditional. Do you know anything about whether or not those same young people actually come to the new works?
That's a good question. I don't know from a data perspective, no, but I think we are certainly seeing that the energy around a new work and the relationship between an audience and a new work is quite different. Because again, people are coming from a different perspective. They're coming to see something that is probing into a different part of life. They're not necessarily coming for a grand date night out to see Bohème. They're coming to delve into works, and we're actively programming works that will allow people to experience a very different part of very real contemporary cultural life in that way. So I think the reasons why people go to certain pieces can be quite different as well. It's not just a universal, let's go to the opera. It's, you can go and experience so many different things because we're telling such grand and epic stories from all facets of life. And so I don't think we can necessarily attribute a singular motivation for how people attend the opera.
And Tim, I wanted to ask you essentially the same question I began with Matthew, and that's about the premise, whether or not in your day-to-day experience working with the National Opera now, if you are making hard choices between a new work and, say, a Janacek work, a new work and a Gluck piece that's going to be hard to sell, is that practically entering into your considerations?
Yeah, I guess I could say that actually I can answer that most vividly from my last job at Opera Theater of St. Louis, where we had only 4 productions to be able to offer every season. And the formula, to the extent that there had been one, had always been, okay, you do one of the war horses, you do one of the lesser-known works by a well-known composer, and then you do something old and unfamiliar, and then something new. And we found that the one that was hardest and hardest to get anybody excited about was the old and unfamiliar one. Even though some of the things that I was proudest of, we did a production of Handel's Riccardo Primo, which talk about the audience having no expectations. We were able to call it Richard the Lionheart because nobody cared, and and it was one of the greatest things that we ever did, in my opinion, but you know, not an easy sell. And so as time went on, our calculus shifted towards, actually maybe in some seasons we'll do 2 new works instead of doing anything in that old but unfamiliar slot. This season, Opera Theater of St. Louis is zagging the other way, and the Coronation of Poppaea is in that slot. So I think in a very real way, yes, I've made that calculation, that probably I have various obligations. I don't think of one of my obligations as to the canon, like to the repertoire itself. That's not an obligation that I accept. My obligation is to the audience and to the institution. So I'll make programming decisions with my artistic colleagues that are meant to serve those ends. And I will say, I think it's important, and I believe Matthew and I would agree on this, because I am intrigued by what you say about protecting the core repertoire and the expectations that the audience carries to it. I actually know exactly what you're speaking about, but it doesn't mean just slavishly doing traditional productions. Traditional is a word that we throw around, and what we tend to mean when we say that, or what I often hear, is we're talking about stupid, under-rehearsed, bad stagings that haven't been well thought out or well directed or given enough time to, you know, blossom into what they should be. So you can do something in its period with visuals that are going to match what the audience expects if they've never been to the opera, without making it stupid, under-rehearsed, or thoughtless. You can do really fabulous work in that style. And those are some of the best nights that we've all experienced in an opera house, and that actually will get a new audience member to say, I am coming back. But so I think the direct answer to your question is yes, some of that middle repertoire is getting squeezed out by some of the energy around new work, and I think that's okay.
Do you see a point in the future where your mental categories, you gave us the sort of old but unfamiliar, that it simply kind of ceases to be one of the regular categories you're even thinking about?
Well, I think, okay, so like I said, we have to surprise the audience. That's part of what the audience expects of us, if it's a subscription audience at an opera house. So yeah, one of the ways you can thrill the audience is by bringing that kind of thing out every so often. So I think it will remain a category in my mind, but I'm not going to do it unless it's an old work that I really believe in. Well, there's certain operas I'm just not going to do.
We'll have to talk about that, because I live in Washington. Elise, I wanted to ask about the repertoire at Cape Town Opera. This is a company that probably has had going on around it socially and politically more change than any opera company in America has ever had to confront. Since 1994, the way the company's funded has changed radically since 1996 with the changes in South African cultural law. And yet it's interesting, if you look at what Cape Town Opera does, there is still a pretty strong presence of some of these works that might even be hard sells in the United States. Purcell, Donizetti that may not be so familiar, Donizetti that's not Lucia. How is it that those things have remained fundamental to Cape Town Opera?
Interesting that you bring up Gluck and Bellini. We just closed I Capuletti Montecchi 2 weeks ago. We're doing Orfeo Eurydice in September, doing quite a lot of Handel as well. So that middle ground is interestingly right in our repertoire. As I said before, what we choose to do is very singer-driven. Imagine growing up in a country where a major form of art was not allowed to your parents. You are a first generation in which somebody says, you can walk through that door if you have the talent. And we have to match the expectation of these phenomenal young singers to the fact that they know that they have the talent. Let's give them the repertoire that best allows them to master it. I know that some of the repertoire that's much heavier, we'd need to import a lot of voices for. We don't have those as much anymore, and it's quite expensive to bring them in. So as we work with the University of Cape Town Opera School, and if you want to get your master's in vocal singing, you can come to Cape Town, and you can get it if you want that. We work with them to figure out what's best for the next crop of tenors, sopranos, and mezzos that's coming out. And with that discussion, not all the productions we're doing are co-productions with the university. Sometimes we're doing it alone. But it really is a matter of matching the voices that we have there and what's going to allow the quality of their voice and the direction of their careers to be able to sing Romeo and Giulietta in a 1,500-seat opera house expertly and well. And that feeds a lot into how we choose what we put on.
So it's really a response to the conditions in South Africa, the singers that you have available. I'm curious about young singers who are coming from places in South Africa that 30 years ago would have had no access to opera, and they're singing in I Capuletti Montecchi. Do they find that relevant to the world they live in? Do they connect with that repertoire?
It's interesting. I was thinking about last year we did Maria Stuarda, and one of our soprano leads, Vupum Pofu. I was chatting with her a year ago, but kind of this question, and she was saying, and as well as the soprano this year, who was our Giulietta, was saying to be allowed the opportunity to perfect an art form, that when you were growing up, no one said to you, you can perfect that. I'm going to give you the resources, the training in the language, the operatic training, for you to show me what you can do. And then they do that. That is, it's a personal goal and an ambition almost of the singers. And as time is going by, and you have Pretty Yende doing what she has done, but following up with Sonny Boyd Lala, following up with Golda Schultz, and more, they're seeing now their young 30s, people who have come before them, becoming those pop stars. They're saying, I can do it too. Who are we to stop that? And if anything, we should be there to allow the right training to come and give them that opportunity to do it. So they're embracing the ability to master an art form that prior to that, no one said you could do it.
I'd like to move on to more practical questions about how tradition informs what we do. We use phrases like, tradition is foundational, it's what we build upon. New operas are sort of derived from this older tradition. But I often wonder whether or not, in fact, how that works, how practically it works. And I wanted to ask Nicole, you said that new masterworks gain in understanding from a relationship to the past. As a conductor who's conducted both Baroque opera, contemporary opera, opera at widely different scales. How does that actually happen? Practically, where do you see those points of contact?
Well, I need to answer that question as a conductor, but then I think it can relate to the whole art form. I think that when I take, for example, a new work, I have the knowledge and the experience of having studied, since I was very young, works from all periods, perform different music, and that informs me on how I will approach a new score, and it depends on the score that I have. But if I have no tools to approach something that is completely new, if I've never gardened, I think sometimes I was thinking about the operatic form as we are growing this huge tree that has roots, and you can't grow a garden if you don't understand the earth that you have. And so I feel that when I look at a new piece, I have this whole knowledge that I can grasp with, and depending on the writing, I can select the tools to interpret it and then give it a true life. And if one of the concerns I have is that if we do not understand the language of today, we're not going to find those masterworks, because we need to understand that language. But that language is rooted in an older language that needs to be, you can't just start this new language all of a sudden. And in the same way, if you look at an older score, I love going to a score of Mozart or something and think of it as a new work, and thinking, what if I didn't know that this was Mozart? How would I approach it if this was a new work that was just sent, just like Jake's score that was sent? I get a score by Mozart. How would I approach it and using those same tools of how it's built, the construction of it, so that all of a sudden there's not this division that we look at this kind of music this way. And this, I think that after a while you have to look at it globally. I do also think that if you do not look at works with a knowledge, I think that companies need to also think that older works need to have as much time. I think, Tim, you addressed that. I think it's I feel very strongly that if you conduct a work, of an older work, and you arrive at this company, conduct, and I arrive there and there are less rehearsal time because the orchestra has played it many times and they know how it goes. Instead of approaching it and saying, let's think about what the tempos are. No, we don't perhaps use that same bowing. Maybe we refresh this because we have aesthetic of our days, and these aesthetic can maybe shed new lights to how we perform Mozart. Mozart was performed, we think of Handel. When Handel's works were created, they were small, and then Messiah became huge because the aesthetic of the time made that people liked huge choruses, so it expanded into a new performance practice. Well, we need to think of performance practices of the older works that are inspired by the aesthetic of the day, of today, so that we perform Mozart perhaps with more transparency or more lighthearted, or whatever the aesthetic is that we have today. And in that same way, we can look at the new works and use the aesthetic of the past and try to gain ideas from how you would. And by that balance, you're treating all works with respect. And you're giving a chance to all this repertoire to survive in any eras of may it be in the 1970s or in the 2050. And I'm a strong believer of that.
You mentioned sort of the institutional reluctance from time to time to give you the chance to kind of reinvent a score, give you the rehearsal time to dig into it. What about audience reactions these days? We're 30, 40 years out from sort of rethinking the way Handel is supposed to sound, rethinking the way Mozart is supposed to sound. Do you still encounter resistance in terms of how the people who are listening to you?
I don't think so. I mean, I remember, a good example, I'll take Handel as an example because it's so apparent how it's been, he's an older composer, so the performance practice has changed a great deal depending on the aesthetic of the time. And I think that what is very interesting is that we're in a century now which at times you can perform Handel in various ways and they all work, which shows that perhaps we are in a time period where we are less restricted. I remember when early music about 20 years ago oh boy, there were rules and you had to follow them. And if, you know, it was like, ooh. And now you can perform Baroque music with much more freedom. And I think that we're perhaps in a period where we're more open-minded to various ways of performing music, as long as it's honest and it's based on knowledge and true understanding and respect of the work.
Great. Jake, I wanted to ask you, because you've worked with young singers and you've been vocal about the importance of doing that. Tell me about what you encounter when you work with young singers, young composers, in terms of how they relate to the core, to the tradition, how well equipped they are, how much freedom they feel to accept or discard it.
I do work with young singers and composers a lot. I do a lot of residencies, and I find it all depends on the teaching that they've got and what the teacher values, because of course these young people come to it not knowing a lot about the past, and having experience with bel canto singing and learning great singing technique, because good singing is good singing is good singing, and it's essential for young singers to have exposure to that. So they're more likely to be exposed to it early on. When I went to UCLA in the 1980s, the only operas we looked at, because it was still kind of looked down on as a bastard art form, and you know, it wasn't taken seriously, you know, it wasn't absolute music. So we looked at what operas did we learn? Pelléas and Melisande, Wozzeck, Lulu, Hindemith operas, things like that. We never once studied a Verdi or a Puccini or a Janacek opera when I was going to school. And I think it speaks to a problem that I encounter with a lot of young composers who want to write opera. Actually, some not so young, some who have like many degrees who say they want to write an opera. And so first we start talking about voices. And they've never heard of a passaggio, and they've never heard of a head voice, and they've never heard of a chest voice or a mix. And I ask them, well, what operas have you enjoyed seeing? Well, I don't really go to opera. Yeah. Or well, name some musicals you like. I don't really go to musicals. Or do you read novels? Do you go to movies? You know, all of these questions, because that implies a curiosity in the whole history of it. And actually, what I have found, and I don't know if you've found this too, the more information that's accessible on people's devices, the less curious they become. Yeah. So I went and worked with some young composers at a very impressive school, I will not name it, who were writing their first art songs. And I asked them, you know, okay, so what's some art songs that have inspired you? And I said, well, what about great singers that really inspire you? And I'm thinking, you have the entire history of art song and every great singer accessible, and you didn't have the curiosity to do that. And I find that incredibly disturbing. And that's one part of technology that I worry about. And so part of my work as a composer who becomes a mentor to young composers or to further along composers is to make sure that they have the information. When I did one program, we spent 4 days. The first day was soprano and mezzo day. We had 4 sopranos in the morning of different types, 4 mezzos in the afternoon. We talked, they each sang something that was very easy for them and something that was very challenging for them. And then we talked about why. So that we started with basics, just of vocal technique, of who the people are who are going to be the ambassadors. I still think of opera as a real celebration of the human voice. And without great voices, without great singers to do it, you're not going to have that strong of an art form. You need those great singers. And that's why I say I think we need some of that pop culture savvy. I wanted to tell you a little story. I went to the Grammy Awards this year, and I was so excited to be there. It was really fun. And in the afternoon, if any of you have been, they give away about 75 awards in like 3 hours. And in the evening on the telecast, they give about 8, because it's mostly about entertainment. And it's amazing. It's an amazing experience in watching the whole thing, how it's produced. And there's the band on stage, and it's exciting, and there's the Latin pop field, and there's the jazz field, and the world music field. Then you get to the classical field, and they start playing string quartets to introduce the different categories. And there's this, you see people starting to look at their watches, and you see them starting to go to the bathroom or get a drink of water and come back. And I realized we need some real savvy about creating this pizzazz that entices people from other fields to join us. And that has a lot to do, if you look at what I was talking about with pop culture savvy, they build star careers. And they find people, it'll give someone a chance, and that person, you look at Lady Gaga, this is a mega star, and she is mega talented. I watched her perform that night, and I had all hail. It was amazing. And she started off studying classical voice as an opera singer. She can sing almost anything. But she has not only the talent, but she has the persistence and eagerness to keep that career going. And what we need to do in our field is nurture young people, build star careers, show them how to build these careers, find a way to cross over into pop culture. Why is it that the last big pop culture crossover classical event was the Three Tenors 25 years ago? And we keep trying to repeat that, and you can't. You have to find something new. And so I think that respect for the ambassadors for the art form, the celebration of singing, for the savvy about how to write for singers, about how to work with them, how to create for them so that they can shine and our work can shine, and the messages that we have today. So yes, I feel very passionately.
From having known you just a bit, I'm going to guess that when you encounter a student who says, well, I don't really know any singers, I don't care about art songs, but I want to write one, that you probably don't say, get out of here and come back when you've done your homework. You have a different message. How do you say to them, go home and do some homework in a way that they can hear it and is meaningful in their education?
Yes, no, I don't want to discourage someone, and shut them out. That's not the point. The point is to direct them to something that they can connect with, and that's where the history of it matters, That's why it being done well, that what came before. Like I said, the flesh and bones that we stand on, even though they might be disappearing, we still stand on what came before. And so directing those young people to things that matter, that have changed lives, that changed your life. That's going to schools, to young people, and sharing what you're passionate about, what makes you excited about it. One of the great teachers who did not fit the mold when I was at school at UCLA, a wonderful man named Paul Desmarais. One day we would listen to all the Chopin preludes and talk about those. Then we'd listen to a Sondheim show, and we'd talk about that and that harmonic world. And then we'd listen to Wozzeck. And then we'd listen to the Beethoven string quartets, because he was passionate about them. And that inspired me to want to go further. And so I think sharing your passion for what you love and what changed your life and what is meaningful to you is really important. And it is for a foundation for all these young people who want to move into this field because they sense there is a lot of excitement and creativity in the opera world. Now that is different. That is really exciting. You see a lot of young people saying, I want to write an opera. And you're like, why? Well, it's so exciting. It's like, and it is, and it's why I continue to want to write, because I find new things to express, new talent that inspires me, colleagues that I love to work with. We're so blessed with great colleagues in this field. So giving that person who wants to write an art song but has never listened to an art song, talking to them about the fundamentals of it, and again, sharing what makes you passionate about it with them is all that's the key. That's the legacy. That's what we pass forward. And that's the only way you're going to get people to show up. And this is another thing we all talk about a lot, is how do we get people to show up today? It's a big issue. What you program, how you program it, who's the star that they're coming to see. What is the starry event attraction about this that makes it special and worth parking and driving and a babysitter and paying all that money and dealing with traffic, Big questions, but I don't know that the answers are as elusive as we think. We just have to be very proactive about engaging and not being ashamed of participating in that kind of pop culture, I think there was this thing for a long time about being ashamed, that it meant we were compromising our work, or like we can't deal with that. And that's not the attitude to have, because that is technology and that's how it's moving forward, and that's the dynamic.
Great. Daniel, I want to turn to you and go back to a word from your provocation, pedestal, getting things off the pedestal. interesting word when we've been also talking about ideas like foundations. The core canon, traditions, and so on are the foundation upon which new things are built. But there's also this danger of things being on a pedestal and taking them down. I'm just wondering, in your career, how essential was it to you to grapple with the history of opera?
Well, I'm a well-educated American boy. I went to Northwestern, where the philosophy was that you really do have to learn the form and learn the rules to break it, but that fundamentally the artist's duty is to break and create new rules. And that's something incredible about Northwestern's philosophy, is that it's about future thinking, artistic action, action within the community, and always pushing that art must have. I remember day one, our first lecture from the head of the theater department, all art must question the religious, political, and cultural institutions of our time. And they said it every single day. So, I began with I would say a history of theater. I am a theater artist, for which, to speak to the snobbery of opera and the pedestal, I will never be accepted in the club. I didn't hear enough operas by age 13.3 or something. So I'll never be a purebred, even if I can sit down and play them, evidently. It doesn't matter. But I have, maybe out of the soil of my own poetry, to quote Arthur Miller, I had an explosive childhood in the Bible, snow and corn belt. What a terrible combination. Christians in the cold reading the Bible. Terrible. Eating popcorn. I had a lot to say. And when you have a lot to say and you don't know how to write yet, or you don't know how to compose yet, those masterpieces are right there, and you know that there's something that you can bounce up against. They're so sturdy. Ibsen, Chekhov, Shakespeare, they're so resistant. There's so much elbow space and so much to react to. And then it was after my second show that my acting teacher took me aside and said, maybe you should create your own work. Which was fun, but much harder. But then, of course, I went to New York City for a year, and I didn't understand New York at all. I didn't even know how to get near the Metropolitan Opera, with all due respect. It was ridiculously too expensive. I literally couldn't permeate the doors. I'll be very frank. On another hand, I didn't feel comfortable going inside the public theater, George C. Wolfe's public theater. I really genuinely felt that I didn't belong there as a white male. And Michael Mayer asked me to assist him on a little musical called Spring Awakening, and I was like, what's that? Went well. And I fled to Europe after working with Richard Foreman and the Wooster Group. I fled to Europe. Peter Brook took me aside, Simon McBurney took me aside and said, if you want to do daring political theater, it certainly can't be in America. You must go to Europe, where they cherish these things. And then you go to Europe, where deconstruction is the name of the game. You see Thomas Ostermeyer, you see Ivo van Hove, you see Mushkin, you see all the great artists in Europe bouncing off against the classics. But again, that's because they're in a 420, 600-year-old tradition of white male literature that has to be bounced up against. And so I kind of fell into that mold. Sometimes it being a trap. I now find that when I get hired, I have many opera houses, only in Europe, say to me, we want you to set the audience on fire. We want them to walk out. It's got to be the most... you got to go all the way, Daniel, which is just as horrible as it was when I tried to do my first Broadway show of everyone going, you don't offend anyone, what about my response to the material just being the thing that leads me? So I think that the pedestal is something that you're always in dialogue with, and as now that I've run an opera house, and I do feel a much stronger relationship and sense of duty towards an audience, towards a journey with an audience. But I want to specify on that. We have to be very careful, because we're all speaking in isolation of our own opera houses. I live in a city with 2 massive opera houses. One of them's job is to keep the fringe on the Surrey on top, with all the petticoats and Carmen ruffles and Jonas. And then my job is to serve like the fruitcake deformed, weird, upside down thing of that. But that works, and how sad is it that New York City doesn't have a thriving, daring, risking New York City opera right now? It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous, America. It's ridiculous that one of the world capitals doesn't have that dialogue to chat with Renee and Jonas, and the huge, I mean, I saw Turandot last year. I was in Peter's box. Amazing. And Domingo was right there. And of course, he'd sang the original thing in 1987, and he was conducting the whole piece. That Turandot is unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's so incredible. I'm doing Turandot right now. It will destroy that production on many levels. But we need to have that dialogue. You look at Berlin, you've got the Staatsoper, which is the great white shark of music and classical theater. You've got the Deutsche Oper, which is a little bit down the middle, and you've got Barry Kosky, who's realized he needs to be the tropical fish of Berlin. But it works beautifully. And then you look at towns like Antwerp, where Aviel Khan has cultivated for 10 years an extremely progressive, forward-thinking audience, that if you did Magic Flute in any sort of realistic set, it would be like the most radical thing you could do. I went to Basel 2 years ago, and I did Traviata, and of course the English were like, "You're the devil, you should burn in hell, that's terrible, how could you do that to Traviata?" It was the #1 selling show in Basel, and they said, "You're so commercial." But I say this with real seriousness. It's very, very relative. We are all on this panel having to achieve very different things for the city that we're in based on how opera lives in that city. I've got an interview here tomorrow for my American debut. God, I hope I get it. I really do. But I know that I actually have to be much more reverent of the pedestal crossing the Atlantic back to my homeland. Because as we've heard, some of the American audiences have never even heard this opera. And so I've got to find a very, very fine line as an artist where you deliver a story that matches the libretto, which of course in Europe, we don't care what the libretto says, you can read it up there. It's a recommendation. So, what I'm insisting for myself, that the only way I could possibly take this job, and I'll wrap up here, the only way I could take
This is good. No, keep.
but the only way I could take that job also is if I can dig so deep into the music, into every note, into every syllable, and make sure that I can find something deeper than Donald Trump, deeper than easy, I'll call them Royal Shakespeare's Company. Oh, we said it in the 20s. Oh, whatever. What is that? What's the difference between 1920 and 1850? How does that help me as a modern audience member? If I can actually find something that is horrifically essential for that community to face in the music. And if I can't, I really can't do the piece, and I shouldn't do the piece, but also nor should they be programming it for their community if it doesn't actually extract something that they need to talk about. So I think the dialogue with that tension with the pedestal should be something none of us should ever, ever, ever lose. And I agree with Jake wholeheartedly, and at least I always look to Beth for being the future of American opera and producing the greatest work in the world right now. I expect all of those composers have trained against the classics. I still believe, and I got very upset with the Oxbridge Club and the Royal Academy when they stopped for a while. If you studied Dickens, you read anything around Dickens except Dickens. Read the Dickens. Study classical painting, study classical drawing, you have to. But it is so much the pedestal that you can shatter so much better if you know the history that you're carrying forth and that you're innovating.
Beth, I was struck by one thing that Daniel said in particular in relationship to your work. And he was talking about the way in which the expectations that you bring to it can sometimes be entrapping. They want him to do work in a certain kind of way. And you've been pioneering a new kind of opera for long enough that I wonder if you've gotten to the point where there is an expectation, a coalescence of a new sense of traditionalism about the work that you're doing.
I don't think there's an expectation for the work. I feel an expectation for what I wear and put on my feet. But I think, in terms of the work that we do, From when I started and even now, I'm always trying to figure out how do you create a dialogue that allows somebody to come in with no expectation. And I was thinking about what you were saying, how the audience comes into this beautiful jeweled house and they have this huge expectation. And that's right, that is their expectation when you walk into that kind of a theater. So I think the movement to take opera out of those spaces, not the big canon works that you're doing, although Heartbeat Opera is doing that, and they're reorchestrating it for chamber, and it's a whole new game, right? But if you take the opera out of the opera house, you've then eliminated one expectation, right? Then what happens if you don't actually call it opera? Because I find when I started and even now, there's a barrier for audiences just with the word opera. So I racked my brain for years to think about it. I didn't really ever come up with anything great, but what we call our stuff is opera theater. And that's opera-theater with an R-E, right? So people look at it and they're like, I don't know what that is. Yes, that's exactly what I want you to think, is you don't know what that is. So then you're gonna come into the arena, wherever it is, if it's a 200-seat black box space or a 2,000-seat theater, and you're gonna say, I don't have any expectations. And then the audience is open. They're open to an experience that can lead them down a very different path that isn't about, are you wearing the red dress? It is about something totally unique to whatever that space is going to give you, whatever that particular production has for you. And the audience can receive it without thinking of it in comparison to the history. They come in and think about it just on its own terms. And I think more than anything, if we want to take opera into the future, whether that is the repertoire, whether that is the new, you have to shatter the expectation in some way if you're going to bring in that new audience, if you're going to bring the art form to a new place that isn't just recreating the museum work, but that is about making it relevant into a world today that speaks to people. So I think the more we can shatter expectations in every possible way is the way that the art form will succeed in the future.
Let me follow with that. Yeah. I think it was Matthew who said that when you did the Gato Carmen, that it was some of the younger people who were saying, actually, we wanted a traditional. And that actually jives with research that was done by the Wallace Foundation, actually at Opera Theater St. Louis. And in some of this research, one of the things that they were saying is that they wanted to know how to prepare when they go to the opera. I'm wondering what you would say to somebody who wants to know how to prepare when they go to one of your works.
I say don't prepare.
Don't prepare at all.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think in terms of what Daniel was saying about knowing the tradition before you break the rules, I fully believe that with the artists. I think the artists need to have if you're gonna write an opera, you need to have a sense of what came before you. And then you can shatter the heck out of it. But know that you're doing that and know what stands before you to inform the future. And then I think some of the most interesting work that's being created is somehow referencing tradition, but doing something wholly new. But I think, you don't prepare for something that I'm gonna bring to you. You just walk in and receive it. And however you receive it is your experience and it's valid. If you hate it, you hate it. If you love it, you love it. If it speaks to you and it makes you cry, awesome. Honestly, my goal with our work is to just give people an experience that will make them think, that will make them feel, that will make them experience something. And if that something is they don't like that, well, that's valid. But hopefully we've made them think about something in a different way.
I'm interested in that. I write mainly about the visual arts, and in the field in which I work, there are usually two kinds of audiences. There's an audience that knows every detail of art history, from kind of Gothic art through to the Renaissance, and then to Impressionism. And then there are the people who know every new thing that happened at every Biennale for the last 10 years, and they really know it, and they know that in the same way, in the same intense way that that other audience knows everything that happened over that past 500 years. Is there an audience emerging that you see, a new, call it an opera audience or an opera theater audience, that parallels that audience for sort of the biennales and the new works, intensively knowledgeable about contemporary work in a way that when they come in, they can relate what they're seeing, new works, to basically a fast-forming new history.
I mean, that certainly exists in New York City. I'm not certain that it exists all over the country, but for sure, people in New York that like this kind of work, have been watching this kind of work, understanding this kind of work, yeah, they know everything. But that has existed for years and years, and people who are interested in contemporary performing arts, they know Pina Bausch, they know Bob Wilson, they know Philip Glass, they know the people that have sort of been the pioneers, and they could probably recite every single show that they've ever created. So I don't think that's new, but I don't know that that's an experience outside of the major metropolis.
Right. The only question is, would you make work differently if there were more of those sort of people in the audience than people coming?
Oh, interesting. No. I think for me as a producer, the work that I'm making, my job is to enable artists, right? And I choose artists that are generally interested in pioneering new paths forward and blazing new trails. It's my job to respond to them. So if they want me to produce whatever it is, and okay, you mentioned Prism, let's take Prism, which won the Pulitzer this year. Well, Act 2 of Prism is in a club. It's got an electronic score. It's got an electronic beat happening through the whole thing. There's electronics through the whole project. That comes to me and I say, great, let's do it. David Little for Dog Days, when he called me and said, I think the last 20 minutes of the opera has no text. And I think it's like a noisescape. Is that okay? And I said, well, if that's how you hear it, it's okay. Like, let's do it. So I think our job as producers is to walk with the artists side by side with them and really having an incredible communication between us and a trust that is formed, that you want to present their work as they want to do it without putting the restrictions on them.
Great. Let me ask a similar question to the establishment.
That's it. That's all you.
Can I insert a quick
Please.
response, which is that one of the great innovations of taking the idea of the art form outside of the traditional venues is not just that we change the expectations of the audience, but you can actually change the numbers of people that cause the thing to feel successful. Because one of the problems of theater since the beginning of the form is that there's fixed inventory in seats in a theater. And so if you have a sellout for 400 people, it's a success. If you have 400 people in a 2,000 seat house, it's a failure. It's the same 400 people who love the hell out of it, but our perception is impossible to change in this way. So one of the great innovations is changing the inventory to suit the demand by changing the venue. Sorry.
Totally.
So what I was going to ask is essentially a variation on what I was asking Beth. Would you rather have a knowledgeable audience or an adventurous audience? And don't say that they can be the same thing, because they can be sometimes, but if you had a choice between a cognoscenti and people who are just really interested in anything, what would you take?
Adventurous.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Matthew?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges in opera in the last, I'd say, 100 years, and going back to the point about the Opera House used to be this great place of kind of civic melting pot, where the community came together, and the kind of intellectualization of opera in many ways, where you do end up with this expectation of a knowledge base where people know the great singers of the past, and there's almost this sense that to have a conversation about opera, you need to have all of this legacy of the history. And one of the things I'm kind of thinking about as the conversation happens here is this differentiation between the reverence for the tradition and the history of that tradition that informs the creative process. You don't have to have that same reverence for all of the detail of that tradition to be on the receiving end of it. You can have it and it's incredible, and I often think about the analogy to wine. If you can have amazing knowledge about wine and you can go deep and deep and deep as a consumer of wine, but you can also just enjoy a damn good glass of wine. And I think what we're trying to do is really what you were saying as well, is you want people to come in and be moved and to feel something. And in an ideal world, we're a place where people expect that they can come into the building and have that, whether or not they know the story, whether or not they've heard of this thing called Yennefer that's sitting on our stage. They trust that when they walk in at the door, they're going to feel something because we've chosen to put it on with the right singers in the right production. And my sense is that the theater world has that down better than the opera world at the moment. The theater world, there is a greater willingness of the audience to go on a journey with the company. In the opera world, it tends to be piece by piece, and it's, if I feel like one thing we can do at the moment in the city is just to create that unshakable belief that you can come to anything in this building and it's going to be worth your while. Again, you may not like it all the time, but it's going to be worth your while.
Nicole.
Yeah, it reminds me, when I was a student, I had the opportunity to have this class with Samuel Adler. And I remember talking to these conductors in the class and saying, the worst thing you can do for your career is to be a jet set conductor. He said, what you wanted to do is you want to settle yourself in a community and develop a relationship, understand them, understand what they like, what they need, have a thought of what you want to add to that community, because you're an artist and you want to add something new. You want to sort of finish the fabric. But then also develop a relationship so strong. If you're going to be a successful artist, if you can develop a relationship that it doesn't matter what you're presenting, they come because they want to see what you're doing. They like what you're doing. And they like the fact that they can't expect that it will be one thing. Yeah, it's trust in the way that you can present various things and that they'll just go because of that. And I think that's the key to the success. I would say, we struggle too with the word opera. And I've sort of taken the other approach now. I really believe that I really love, actually, when we do an opera with kids, and the kids are like, okay, we're going to opera class now. And I love the fact that we're keeping that word in our vocabulary. We don't want to apologize about that word. We want to love it. We want young people to love opera. And let's call it what it is. Let's not be apologetic. And let's say, yes, opera. And I love when people come to a production we do, and they go, oh, is that opera? I didn't realize it. I like opera. I love that. And I say, yes, this is opera. And you might try something else. And I do think that it's really important not to be apologetic about this art form and really convince people that opera is great. And I really agree with Jake in saying, let's not be stodgy. Let's keep it alive, and let's say this opera is as cool as Lady Gaga.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, let's keep it alive and commit to our community. And it will be different depending on which community you're in. New York will be very different than San Francisco.
I wanted to follow up on something you said earlier, Nicole, as well. You were talking about the importance of a contemporary canon of new work. And I think we all understand the importance of new work, having a flow of new work, a constant production of new work. But tell me about the importance of the canon of it. What value is given by that winnowing process of going from a stream of new works to a canon of new works?
Well, I think if we look back, and we were talking about, those works, obscure works from composers from the past that we like to sometimes put in on our season, and you start to realize that very often there is a reason why this work has remained obscure. And you love it maybe, but it's not that popular. And so it's very important, and all of a sudden you identify the composers, and some composers will have works that perhaps have been written at a time where it was, it's a better piece of art. And it takes time to evaluate that. It takes various productions. It takes, it maybe dies for a while, it comes back and all that. But if we do not, right now we're very vibrant. We create, we're composing all the time. Everyone's doing new works. And we don't often have the chance to see an opera more than once, hear it again, and really investigate what the true value of that work is. Because perhaps it was just not the right production. Perhaps it was not done we learned so much from a first production. So I do think in the 21st century, we need to go, when we get to the 20th century have our Verdi and our Mozarts and all of that. And the way to do that is to give a chance to our composers to hear and to maybe change their works and to really establish. And then to also decide, you know what, this was not my best work. I think I would rather not have that in my canon. These are my great works. You can't write 100, Verdi, not all of Verdi's opera are great, right? So I do think that if we can invest energy in that and have confidence that maybe it's not because a piece did not get the right reviews or did not, was not a success. And I agree with Beth completely. I really think at times if people come to a performance and hate it, I think, good, that's a good sign. If people love it and hate it, it means it's a piece that sort of shakes you and you want to think about it. But it's not because the reviews are bad that you have to let it go and not perform it again. Let's give it a chance again. Let's try a different way of performing it, and maybe it will be a masterwork.
Yes. All of that, but also part of what we do is, this is really all about community and engagement, and the art form doesn't really soar until the community is there and participating. And having a piece done several places, it's really interesting to be able to say, oh yeah, I saw that production here, did you see it here? And then comparing notes on what you gleaned from that experience versus that experience. That's why the classics, they give us common ground to talk about, our experience with that work, and why doing new works in many different venues give us another chance for a dialogue of what matters to us and how we feel about certain things in the field. So I just think that that's also something to consider about why we do it and how it spreads and how things become part of a canon, because they initiate a dialogue. I mean, my obvious example would be my first opera, Dead Man Walking, which this year, at the end of this year, will have its 70th international production, which is a miracle. And at the beginning, it was pretty divisive. There were people that really hated it. There were people that loved it, but there was no one that was ambivalent about it. And that was very encouraging to me. And the fact that now all these companies have done it has opened up a dialogue about a contemporary, it's almost 20 years old. That's pretty young for new opera, right? Anyway, but it's opened up a dialogue with different companies, and I find that is part of the experience in terms of audience building, in terms of communication, in terms of, again, the dialogue that we all create around our field.
And so as your work becomes canonical, do you find it enters into the same category?
I'm establishment, oh no!
But in a sense, as it becomes canonical, it gets farther and farther removed from the composer. It's subject to more and more interpretations, and does it get ossified?
No. But those are the pieces that are really interesting, are the ones that, first of all, they're kind of bulletproof, that people try to kill them many ways as possible. We've all been to like horrible productions of classics as well as great. The piece still survives, right? If a piece can only be done one way, it's probably not a very good piece and it won't survive. If a piece, like you said, you knock against those classics, that's why they're classics. They can take a beating, and they can take a lot of different viewpoints. But if a piece can't take that, it's probably not going to last in the canon. And that's why I'm interested in finding pieces that maybe are not ripped out of the headlines about something topical right now, but maybe it has broader resonance, that it's a timeless subject that people have dealt with, but it feels current and it feels of our time, and yet timeless. And then I look forward to the beating that it's going to take by different productions and different performers, and what I'm going to learn about the piece from them that I had no idea about. And that has happened again and again, where I've seen a new performer do a role in a piece of mine, just go, I never knew that was part of this opera. That's exciting to me, the people that we work with, the community of these creative minds, what different perspectives will bring into that. That's why we can see Elektra brand new, or we can see Bohème or Carmen brand new, like, what? How come I never saw that? Or revelatory performances by great star performers who somehow bring out a different level of humanity that moves us and touches us very deeply, that maybe that piece did not resonate with us before. So those are, anyway, I'm going on. Maybe that's kind of part
Tim,
of it.
you were going to say.
From the establishment, I want to stipulate a couple things. One thing to just acknowledge, because we haven't touched on it, but it's a really important part of this conversation about tradition, I think, is that some things were traditions and then they have to go away because they're not useful anymore. And there is a lot in our core canon, whether it's theater or opera or literature, that is just not for today's audience. There's sexism in some of these stories that is, unless really well interpreted, is not going to be useful. I saw a production of Mozart's Abduction from the Seraglio at Glyndebourne that was so spectacularly great, directed by David McVicker, for an audience that was just so bought in to the idea of Mozart and rediscovering this work that I thought, my God, what a masterpiece. But I'm probably not going to produce that opera because it's impossible to produce, I think, in this day and age because of the stereotypes about Muslim characters. I don't think it's worth my time to put myself and my institution through that, right? So that's something that needs to be acknowledged. The other thing that needs to be acknowledged is that, of course, that part of the purpose of and the strength of bringing in new work to, yes, take some of the places of old works is that it allows us to tell new stories and have representation from artists of color and people who have not been represented on our stages, which is not only makes us interact with our culture of today, but it's actually economically necessary for institutions if you're in charge of running an institution. So that all needs acknowledgement. But then I just want to say one other thing, which is that I'm a 40-something-year-old now general director of a major company, and we just did Tosca. And I never had really loved Tosca before. It was not my favorite Puccini opera. And we did this Tosca that was, the sets are literally from like the 1940s, forced perspective, painted scenic drops. I don't think there's anyone alive today who could have painted these sets. It's a lost art. So unbelievably beautiful. And the director, a young American director out of the theater world, Ethan McSweeney, caused all the things to happen that are supposed to happen in Tosca. She'd put the candles down on the right chords and all of that. I had never seen that. I had never seen a production of Tosca live in the theater that did that. And that's a sign of the times. And actually, you know what? It really works that way.
We're getting close to the end, but Daniel and then Beth.
I just wanted to chime in and say I think it's great that we bring up content in this conversation in terms of the problem of the canon. How many more suffering, dying women can we handle? Liu is tortured for 14 minutes in Turandot. And so in my rule in accepting that was I'll do it as long as I don't have to torture Liu for 14 minutes. So I'll torture him instead. But also time and rhythm. English National Opera, we sell out Philip Glass and Adams. We sell out contemporary music. And everyone, the New York Times called last week, why? I also think Jake and Beth and so many of the composers and librettists in this room, modern audiences in England respond so beautifully to contemporary rhythms and contemporary emotions, and we do feel in different ways now than we did with Verdi. And most of my social group can't stand the Verdis and Puccinis. They think that Bird Whistle is the most exciting thing they've ever heard because somehow it's the experience of walking through New York City with horns and people and throwing themselves in front of you. And I think that the content and the rhythm and the change of our emotional textures is also something that new audiences are responding to and that we must respond to. 420 years essentially of a white male canon with a white male gaze has to be readdressed in our interpretations. From our critical voices, that's still something we haven't spoken about today either, when you suddenly still have in England 14 white men over 60 reviewing a fresh interpretation of Salome by a queer female artist. It's a problem. It's a problem. They don't know how to take off their white male gaze to see a black female gaze to save their life. So how do we actually say to a black community, this is actually expressing a viewpoint which you might find interest in when everyone else is going, well, it seems to be politics theater, this new bad term that we've somehow replaced aesthetics with identity politics. Well, welcome to the modern world. Time's up.
Now, one way is to diversify the ranks of critics.
I'm sorry, I just have to add something to this. We had a fascinating situation in the last year or two where we commissioned a new piece based on Tsotsi, the book by Ethel Fugard. Thrilled to get the rights to do that, put together a team to create a wonderful musical. And we had 5 or 6 individuals that came down from Europe and the UK to take a look at it. And one of them walked away and said, the title's great, of course, I can sell the title, but I can't put another story about black men and gangsterism on our stage. I can't tell that story. Again, it's too much. And we had this most amazing discussion about the fact, well, but this is based on the lives of the individuals there. We're not creating something new. This is a story coming out of this country, so when you came to see it, you have to have known this is the reality of the country. So how do we, I couldn't sell it to that person anymore. Maybe somebody else will take it for what it is beyond that story and say, this musical style, which is a very Kwaito-influenced musical style, is worth telling the story because it may not fit what I'm used to from your country, but I'm willing to take a gamble. So it's interesting when you do take those gambles. You don't know who's it going to resonate with. Are they going to see what you want to invest in? Have you spoken to their market or not? You don't know until you try.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick back up on second productions, et cetera. So our model is to tour our productions that we premiere, and the reason for that is exactly this, that a piece must have not just a second, but a third, a fourth, a fifth look. Now, we do it with our production as we tour it, right? So it's the same production. It's the production that the composer and the librettist have had complete input in so that they are really happy with this production representing the work. What I find is very difficult with new work, and that I hear over and over again, is that we're going to have this amount of resources for our main stage, and then we're going to have this piddly amount of resources for the new piece. The Bohème, the Don Giovanni, name whatever great work, can stand up to a really crappy, under-resourced production, and it will last for the next 500 years. But the Dog Days, the Breaking the Waves, et cetera, these pieces, if you under-resource them and you give them 2 tables and a chair, it's not going to fly. You have to put resources into the new work if they're to succeed. And I think it's a really difficult issue right now.
We're getting up to our 5:30 mark. I know that Mark needs to say a few things before we leave, but I just wanted to, just a couple thoughts at the end based on what Daniel and Beth were saying, and the premise about this repertoire that may or may not survive because it may or may not have relevance. We tend to think of the process whereby audiences came up with a canon as one thing, a kind of sorting through. They had 500 years to figure out which of these works matter, and they gave us the canon, which is the Puccini and the Verdi and so on. So it's sort of the best of the best. But Daniel was talking about the way in which that same canon represents the interests of a patriarchal society, a white society, an elite society. So in some senses, it's also the worst of the worst. And we might then ask, if both of those facts are true, what does it mean about the sorting out process that audience was doing over the last 500 years? Are there works, maybe works that didn't get multiple productions, maybe works that had one hit at the bat and fell into obscurity, that actually were in argument with that patriarchal society? Works that were written by women that are not, works in the last 100 years, works in the last 300 years are written by women, works that don't fit in which the characters don't fit the models that are supposed to in terms of feminine and masculine, in terms of gender and race. Is there material out there in that canon that we still have yet to find that could, in a sense, expand the canon of the older works to be more interesting, more representative, and more valuable? We don't actually have time to answer that. I'm just going to throw it out there. And invite Mark to come up and say a few final words.
Great. This is the perfect opening session because they have raised so many questions we'll want to talk about for the next 3 days that we're together. Philip, thank you, and thank you to all these wonderful, wonderful panelists. Really, thank you. Perfect. Thank you. So, I am here to remind you that we